The night rang thin as glass above Castle Black, a sky of brittle stars and a moon shaved down to a cold grin. Wind came slant and knifing from the haunted forest, making the trebuchet frames creak like old knees and setting the ranging bells to their restless clinking. Jon Snow stood on the southern rampart where the frost bit hardest. He had come here out of habit more than need. The dead were not coming tonight, not while the air stayed this clear and cruel, and yet even now his eyes kept straying north to where the pale line of the wall's crown vanished into its own darkness. Behind him the castle slept, lamps snuffed, fires banked to sullen red. The faint coughs of men in their sleep carried thinly on the wind. Ghosts' pads whispered on timber as the white direwolf moved to press his weight against Jon's leg. The wolf's breath fogged the air between them. The sound of it steadied Jon, the way the sound of his own breathing had steadied him once when his heart had stopped and then, impossibly, stuttered back into life. "Stay," Jon murmured without looking down, the word for ghost as much as for himself. He felt the old ache. Duty, loss, love, all wound together until they were the same rope, and he held it like a hilt. Bootsteps sounded from the stair. He did not turn. He knew the tread now, quick and precise, too light to be any of his brothers. Sansa came to stand beside him, wrapped in a cloak of rough spun over better wool, hair pinned against the wind but loosed by it still, a few bright strands painting fire across her cheek. She looked smaller in the black, but her eyes had learned the snow. They did not water or blink. "You never sleep," she said, not unkindly. "Sometimes." His breath smoked. "When I do, it's never here." Her mouth tilted, something like a smile and a grimace in one. "Me, I only sleep here. Walls feel like hands, for once." She laid her palm on the crenel, the fingers reddening at once from the bite of cold. "I brought you a letter." He did look then, and the shape of fear in him stood up like a man. "From where?" "Winterfell." She drew it from her cloak. Pink paper, pink wax, pink always, as if the letter had been drenched in some pale blush of skin and flayed nerve. Jon did not take it at once. He had seen one before. It had made a flint of his chest and left sparks where there should have been air. Sansa's face did not change as he reached for it. She had grown a mask, his sister. Somewhere between there and here she had learned to wear it better than any lady in any far southern hall. He read it twice. He saw the words that were meant to scour at his blood. Bastard, traitor, thief. He saw the name, the boast. He saw the list of demands and the threat that walked beside each of them like a shadow. He set his jaw and folded the letter precisely once. The paper crackled like ice splitting. "He wants you to come," Sansa said. "He expects you to come. He wants a fight," Jon said. The wind pressed at them both, asking questions. Sansa turned so that the wall hid her from it. "If you fight him," she said, "he will make you fight him his way. He is very good at that. He has spent his whole life learning it. He is better even than Joffrey, because he hides his cruelty under sense and he lets other people call it justice for him." Jon shifted the letter between his fingers. The pink had warmed where his skin touched it. "You want me not to fight him. I want you to win. What does that look like?" Sansa's hair lifted. "It looks like he surrenders Winterfell without a single Stark or small folk dying for it. It looks like him on his knees with his knives taken and the North remembering what it is." Her breath shook once and then smoothed. "He can be made to bend. Wolves do not hunt as lone beasts. We circle. We tire. We do not close our jaws until the blood that will be spilled is his alone." Jon studied her long enough that the cold found the bones of his hands. "How?" "We do what he cannot imagine," Sansa said. "We make a country." They sat at the long table in the common hall that night with Davos and Tormund and the handful of men who had followed Jon back from death and worse. Melisandre kept to the shadows near the hearth. Her eyes followed the smoke up and did not come down. Tormund drank and wiped his beard with the back of his hand like a man who trusted both drink and beard. Davos had his fingers set on the table as if counting something with them that no one else could see. "A country," Tormund repeated. "Girl talks like a queen." Sansa took that and did not flinch. "I'm no queen. There's no throne I want, only a home that isn't someone else's lie. She looked to Jon. You swore men through the gates and saved them. You believed an oath could be stronger than old hate. This is the same thing. We make it so that standing with him means starving in a hall full of ghosts. We make it so that standing with you means eating and being warm and hearing your name said with their children's names in the same breath. We make it so that standing with no one is impossible. Davos huffed. You talk like the bankers of Bravos, my lady. It's not coin, Sansa said. It's bread and a bed and safety, and we take none of it from them as long as they keep guest right. We'll make a confederacy. The free folk and the North, bound by oath and by trade. We don't take castles if we can take vows. We don't take vows if we can take need. Jon listened to the dark breathe, to the old would complain in its joints. He put a hand to Ghost's neck, felt the thrum of the animal, live and sure. Tell me, he said. She did. She spoke of White Harbor and of Wyman Manderley, who would starve the Boltons of salt and grain if the right words cut to the meat of him. Davos nodded along without needing to speak. He had seen the inside of that man's appetite for vengeance and justice, which were the same dish on Manderley's plate. She spoke of Glover and Mormont and Ornwood and Serwyn, of how hunger and fear would make them cautious, how pride would keep them from kneeling to a man who killed his own blood. She spoke of the Karstarks and a girl, Alice. Davos's head tipped at that. He knew the name, who had run to the wall once with murder at her back and a plea on her tongue. She married a free folk chieftain, Davos said. A Magnar of then, if the tales are true. They aren't tales, Jon said. He remembered the day, the snow like feathers, the girl's hand cold in his, the gods would watching with its red eyes. I was there. Then make that marriage into a country, Sansa said. Tormund scratched at the corner of his mouth. You mean to bind your Southron with ours? Oath, trade, the way crows bind their rookery. Jon's look found Tormund and held. I mean that if winter takes us all, it will not be because we could not say the words that would have saved us. Tormund grunted something that might have been a laugh. You talk too soft for a king, but I have seen men starve and I have starved myself. And I know the sound feet make when they leave a hall that won't share its fire. You will want a thing. A what? Davos asked, wary. A meeting, Tormund said. A council. A circle where men stand under the sky and say yes or no, and the yes counts because the cold is listening. North of the wall we have talkers, too. Not all of us were wild. We will make your thing snow. I will call the chiefs that live and those who think they are chiefs. Sansa's eyes warmed him in the way no fire could. Then we begin. The thing convened in the trampled yard south of Castle Black, where the earth had known too many boots. The sky was flat milk and the air a taste of iron on the tongue. It was not pretty, but it was honest, and that was how Jon wanted it. He wanted no hall and no high seat, only men and women who would say yes or no and live by that. He stood in the circle and spoke truth to them, the whole of it, in words that were plain and unimaginative. The dead are coming, he said. They do not care which words you use for your gods, or which song you sing when you drink, or what lord your father bent his knee to. They do not leave your children alone because your mother thought a different name sacred. If we are to live, we do it together, and if we die, we will at least have made it costly. He spoke then of the Confederacy, and this was the heart of it. Free land in the new gift for the free folk to farm, to hunt, to make, to sell what they found and wrought, and protection by oath from northern lords who had land more than they had men. No raiding within the bounds of the Confederacy. Disputes to be settled by oath before a heart tree or a hearth fire with witnesses from both sides. When the horns were blown thrice for winter war, every household to send one in 10 to stand where they were told. Those who could not fight would mend leathers, cure meat, sew bandages, and count arrows. Guest right would be the law that bound them. No man who fed a stranger could harm him before the bread and salt left the belly, and kinslaying the crime that stripped a man of all names, his and his fathers, until the snows covered him. Tormund nodded, and many of the free folk nodded with him. Not all. There were grumbles. Oaths that smelled too much like collars, a reckoning too like a tax. Jon did not flinch from them. He told of hard home and of eyes that did not blink and of the cry of bone on bone. He did not have to tell it clever. Fear did his work. By the end of that cold morning, hands had lifted, some reluctant, some proud. They said yes. The next day John wrote letters on thin, scraped parchment that took the ink grudgingly. He wrote Wyman Manderley and Robert Glover and whoever now held Hornwood and Serwyn by right. He wrote Lionel Mormont, whose letter had once been so sharp it had cut their hope in half, and smiled despite himself as he shaped her name. He wrote to the Umbers at Last Hearth with care that was almost tenderness. Each letter carried an oath and a bargain. Safety in trade, freedom from raids, a pledge of free folk spearmen on the day they were called. In return, an embargo upon Winterfell, a refusal to send grain to any man wearing a flayed man, a turning away of Bolton riders at every ford and gate. He asked them to look to their gods and to the man in their hall and to ask which of those two had ever killed his own father. Davos sealed them with plain wax. "You should keep some men to watch after we send these birds," he said, not quite smiling. "We'll have visitors, friends, and others." "We'll be ready," John said. He sent Davos to White Harbor with a handful of the Night's Watch who owed him favors and none to Roose Bolton. The sea road was dangerous in winter, but Davos had always been the sort of man who found the one rock between two shoals and stood on it laughing. They went in a trader's galley with sails patched and a figurehead that had lost its nose. John watched them go with a weight in his chest and did not allow it to change his face. At the same time he wrote to Last Hearth, John sent a raven to a place ravens did not often fly from, Carhold. It was a gamble, but not the sort that sat sickly in his gut. He wrote to Alice Karstark by name, reminding her of the snow that day and of the feel of white bark beneath their hands when she had sworn an oath to the old gods and to a man from the other side of the world. He asked her to bring her husband south to Castle Black when she could, and if she could not, to write by her own hand and tell him whose word counted now in her father's hall. The raven launched from the rookery like a thrown stone. He watched it until it fell into the pail. They came, Alice and Sigorn, 3 days after the raven. The then was broad and grim-faced, his hair like wrought iron laid along his skull, his eyes set deep and flint-bright. Alice wore Karstark black and white with a mantle of thick-stitched essay. Blee. She did not need her cloak to look like winter. She knelt in the common hall before the thing in John that was both commander and little boy watching Robb ride away. She did not look small when she knelt. She looked dangerous. "You asked," she said. "And here we are. Sigorn says thens do not kneel. I told him that kneeling is sometimes a way to show the knife you are holding." Sigorn grunted, which might have been approval. "My folk keep oath. If the Karstark girl says this is what we do it. I will not be made into a crow, but I will stand with you when your horns blow." "Their horns," Alice said, and her eyes were on John's. "The old men at Carhold still drink to Bolton, because fear is a wine they learned to love. But they are tired of biting the inside of their mouths. Show them a world where they do not have to chew their own tongues to survive, and they will spit out the flayed man." Winterfell was a stark hall before we were ever a name. They made a feast of it with what they had. Smoked fish that flaked to salt on the tongue, oatcakes hard as shields, a barrel of sour ale someone had forgotten. Tormund roared approval, and even Melisandre smiled a small, distant smile like a memory of warmth. That night, John gave Alice the letters he had written to the Umbers. She took them with a slow gravity that made them heavier in his hands than they had been before. "Last Hearth is close to Carhold," she said. "We share the same winds and too often the same mistakes. If Small John is as canny as his father, he will sniff the air and see where the frost stays longest before he moves. But if he has set his beard under a Bolton boot, I can bring a knife to the laces." "You've sharpened well," John said. She showed him her palms, the ridges of old burns, the nicks of new cuts. "I had a master for it." Davos's journey to White Harbor took him through waters that remembered storms as stories told slow. He stood on the quivering deck and tasted salt on his lips and thought of the boy he had advised and the woman who had taken what she needed without asking any man's permission. White Harbor rose out of gray like a dream of limestone, gulls ragging the air with their human cries. The wolf's den was only a shape against shapes, but Davos felt it like a hand on his back. Wyman Manderley received him in a solar that smelled of baked bread so powerfully that Davos's stomach muttered like a sullen child. The Lord himself was a mountain with eyes. His graying hair was close-cropped against his skull. His fingers were thick as sausages, the nails clean and neatly cut. He stood to greet Davos, and the table between them creaked as if it were relieved to be rid of him. "Onion Knight," he rumbled, as if he were naming a ship. "You have the look of a man come to ask me for something I already want to give." Davos bowed. "It's a politeness to let me ask." "Be polite, then." Manderley sank back into his chair and reached for a loaf. He tore it in two and handed Davos half, and only then gestured to the wine. Davos ate the bread standing. It tasted of fat and herbs and a hearth he had not earned. "Jon Snow sends his greetings," he said when the crust was gone. "And his offer." He laid the letter on the table, and Manderley took it carefully between two fingers, as if it might be rarer than it looked. He read, lips moving a little. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at Davos with an old hunger slaked only by the notion of justice. "The boy wants me to starve Winterfell. The boy wants you to feed your own people first. He wants you to close your gates to men who wear flayed skin like a jest. He wants you to remember the sound your hall made the day you executed Freys who broke bread with you and then broke you." Manderley's mouth went tight, then softened. "You are what you are, Onion Knight. Not a poet, thank the gods. Yes, I will close my gates to the Boltons and any who ride for them. My ships will not carry their salt. My cellars will not store their grain. If they want fish, they can learn to use a net and freeze their fingers off. I will speak to the guilds and the captains. When the sea says no, the land hears. Jon Snow says that for every sack of grain not sent to Winterfell, there will be 2 sacks kept from raiders north of the wall because there will be no raiders. He means to keep the free folk on their side of the fence by taking the fence down and pointing at the dead coming to jump it." Manderley's laugh was big and slow. "The boy sounds like a man. Tell him that the Manderleys of White Harbor will stand with the North when the North stands. Tell him that when his horns blow, my harbor will ring with them. Tell him that no Bolton man will eat so much as a pickled herring in White Harbor until he kneels in Winterfell with his hands bound and his name unmade." The letters went out. Some returned with answers that made Sansa close her eyes for a moment and let out the breath she had been holding since she learned to read. Lyanna Mormont wrote a letter that was 3 lines long and full of iron. She named the enemies of her ancestors and swore herself to none of them. Glover sent a careful, cautious hand that had learned caution late. Hornwood scratched its answer as if a knife had done the writing. Serwyn begged for salt, and Davos sent it. From Last Hearth there came no raven at first, and then a raven with its feathers ragged and a ribbon tied at its leg in umber green. Jon slit the ribbon with his thumb while Tormund watched, big and intent. The letter was short in a different way. It named small things, the way wolves had been seen near the barley fields where no wolves had come in 2 years, the way the snow had drifted in the lee of the old mill like a feather bed pulled over a child. It did not name Ramsay. It did not name Small John. At the bottom there was a name that had not been written in 20 years in any letter that left Last Hearth. Edera Umber. "Gee, Riachan's sister," Davos said. "She married to keep a peace and did not get one for it." Jon set the letter down. "She wants a thing." They rode to the Long Barrow because the gods listened there. 100 mounds slept under the snow, the grass bristling through like whiskers, stones thrust up at angles like old swords. The wind had not the courage to find its way properly among the dead. They came in small parties, with no banners and few horses, and stood in a circle that widened as more wished to stand inside it. There were Manderley men in whale oil leather and Risswell men who had walked away from their fathers' gates, and 2 Glover boys whose feet were wrapped in rags because their shoes had fallen to pieces. There were free folk, Magners and raiders and wives with knives in their boots. There were Carhold men and women, and a girl with hair like winter pale and eyes like knives. There were 3 sworn brothers in black who stood a little apart as if remembering they were meant to be post and not part. Edera Umber stood with her head bare. Her hair was white as salt. She looked at Jon without much expression and then at the sky above his head. as if to be sure it had not fallen yet. "Tell me what you want," she said. John told her. He told all of them. He spoke of oaths that made room for breath. He spoke of the free folk in the gift, not strangers but neighbors. He spoke of trade and of raids that would stop and of children who would learn each other's names at crossing stones. He spoke of winter and the dead and the need for men to stand where they were told. "You ask me to turn my back on a man who holds my kin at his mercy," Edera said. "He has small John in his hall." John met her eye and did not look down. "He uses kin as shield because he has none of his own. Show him that a shield holds nothing but a shaking hand when there is no arm behind it, and he will learn soon enough that mercy is something he cannot eat." "You have a sharp tongue," Edera said. "I have a hungry land," John said. They spoke for a long time under the flat gray sky. The dead of the long barrow did not stir. In the end Edera lifted her head like a wolf catching a new scent and said, "I will not hand the boy my house's food and call it strength. I will keep my small folk from his riders. If he wants umber bread, he can come take it. And when he does, my men will be gone from the bakehouse and the stones will be too slick for his horses. I will not fight him in a field. That is what he wants. I will not bleed the north to water his pride. I will starve him until his men feel their guts gnawing, and then I will watch which way they look. If they look north, I will show them the road." It was not everything. It was something. It was enough. They set the blockade like a net made of patience. White Harbor closed its gates to any man whose cloak showed the flayed man. Manderley ships stopped being seen on the White Knife above the third bend, and the fishermen who might have sold their catch in Winterfell sold it instead along the banks. No coin taken if the buyer wore a rag on his arm to mark his oath to the Confederacy. At Deepwood Motte, Robert Glover's people trained dogs to snarl at the smell of Bolton leather and sent them down the road with children who learned to whistle a particular tune that made the dogs act as if they had seen a bear. At Carhold, Alice spoke to old men in low rooms where the fire felt far away and told them the story of a man who had killed his father and dogs that ate babies, and how the curse for kinslaying was not a name but a winter that never ended. The old men shivered at the tale like boys. The next morning, they told it to their sons. Ravens flew. They carried letters, and those letters did not contain threats. They contained prices. Any man who kept his guest right, any woman who swore such a man into her hall, would not see a single free folk raid within 20 miles of her hearth while the Confederacy stood. Any man who raised a hand to a Confederate guest would find that his neighbors had no bread to sell him and no wood to spare. There were lists, small and particular, of what would be needed when the horns blew for the dead. Nails, boiled leather, dried herbs, linseed. Strong boys who could carry water and were too young yet to be sent to die. The lists were copies of copies, circulating like the breath of a living thing through the North's nose. At Winterfell, Ramsay Bolton read some of the letters and burned others. The Maester, Wolken, watched him without letting his eyes show what they were seeing. There were fewer ravens perched in the rookery trusses now, and more bones in the kitchen midden. The well in the inner ward had not gone low in living memory. It was low now. Men took to pissing in the snow farther from the door, as if that could convince their bellies they would not have to drink their own water. Riders sent out in late noon returned in the blue dusk empty-handed and with their horses' ribs showing. Twice they did not return at all. A week went by with no bread baked in the keep. 2. Ramsay ordered the ash from the great hearths sifted for any coal that might be hiding. When one of the women cut her hands bloodily on a clinker, he made her lick the blood from the hearthstone and told the men to laugh. They did. The sound the laugh made told the listening walls more than Ramsay wanted to hear. John did not bring his army south to dig trenches and build siege engines. He brought his people and set them along the roads and the rivers and the unseen little paths men use when they want to avoid a road or a river. He put thens by the timber camps, because thens knew the sound would makes when it falls and could hear the absence of it. He placed raiders turned watchmen on the old game trails and gave them orders to take no game until the Confederacy stores were full. He sent lyres and drums to hamlets where men had not heard music in a season and told their players to remind people their hands were good for more than counting losses. He let Sansa send letters that had nothing within them but the names of the dead and the places where they would be remembered once this was done. Once, when they were camped by the crook of a river that ran as slow as a thought, Jon stood alone beside the water while the stars made a broken necklace of themselves on the black. Sansa came to him and said nothing until the silence had said what it could. "You put your life into words," she said. "You always have." "I put my life into oaths," Jon said. "You took those oaths and made them into letters. I don't know if that's what a country is, but it feels like one. It feels like a story someone might tell a child who did not think he would live long enough to be a man." Sansa's breath fogged. "You will live. Long enough to die at the right time," Jon said and smiled without warmth. "Long enough to see him kneel." They needed one thing more, Sansa had said at the beginning. They needed proof. Not of cruelty. Ramsay wore that the way other men wore fur, but of the thing that turned men's eyes inward, toward what they prayed to in the night. Kinslaying. That accusation was a knife one did not bring to a table unless he meant to use it. It was Wolkan who gave it to them, though he did not know he was giving them anything. A raven meant for the Dreadfort broke from the rookery at dawn and flew toward the flayed man that had given it its route since before Wolkan had a chain. It carried orders for the flensing and nailing of a man's hand to a gate in Barrowton. A man who had said a name too loudly in a market and allowed it to be heard by a fry who had not yet starved. It carried, in Wolkan's fussy hand, the notation that the orders were given by Lord Ramsay Bolton in the full absence of and without advice from his father Lord Roose Bolton, the latter having died, and here the words had been scraped and rewritten, of poison administered by the Lady Valda. Tormund's spearwives took the bird out of the air with an arrow that had been sharpened on a story of hunger. They brought the rag of parchment to Jon, who read it with careful eyes, and then to Sansa, whose face did not change. That night, they sent 4 ravens with 4 copies to 4 houses. In the morning, Edera Umber's answer came back with a piece of ribbon attached to it. It had come from a phrase sleeve. There was blood on it. The parley was Sansa's idea. She said it almost idly. "He believes in himself as more than a man. He thinks there is nothing that cannot be made to kneel. He wants to play with you. Give him a game." The game she offered was older than either of them. "We ask him to meet under the heart tree in Winterfell's Godswood," she said. "It is sacred ground. He pretends to believe in nothing, but he will believe in his men's fear." "He will think it a trap," Jon said. "Make it a trap," Sansa said. "For his own story. He believes men are dogs who answer only to pain. Make him see that fear is a kind of leash with 2 hands on it." Jon sent a letter that called Ramsay Bolton to the Godswood with the promise of safe conduct and guest right, and he meant those words even as he wrote them. If he was to break the world to mend it into another shape, he had to choose where his own hands would bleed and where they would not. He signed it with his name and the names of those who had signed with him: Tormund Giantsbane for the Free Folk, Alice Karstark for Carhold, Edera Umber for Last Hearth, Wyman Manderley for White Harbor, Robert Glover for Deepwood Motte, Lyanna Mormont for Bear Island. He added a 7th name, Sansa Stark, with the title that was hers by right, Lady of Winterfell, and let the ink dry black and sure. Ramsay came. He came because he could not imagine not coming. He came with 4 men-at-arms, none bearing spear or sword, guest right having been invoked in words that were older than his house and colder than his dog's noses. He came with Wolkan, who trembled and did not try to hide it. He came with a smile that showed too much gum. Winterfell's Godswood was a white place where sound went to lie down. The heart tree's face was long and sorrowing, its eyes red and wet, its mouth downturned as if it were looking at an old friend who had made a mistake too large to set right. Snow lay in the folds of its roots like a sleeping child. Jon's breath smoked when he bowed his head to it. "Lord Ramsay," he said. Ramsay's eyes darted the way a ferret's does. "Bastard," he said, beaming merrily. "Ah, forgive me. I forget you like snow. There's something poetic about it. All that white, all that blank. One can write anything in it, can't he?" Jon did not rise to the bait. "We're under the heart tree," he said. "There's nothing in me that will break guest right. If there is nothing in you that will, we can speak plainly. We'll see how plain you like it." Ramsay said. He looked up into the weeping eyes. How drab. Does it never tire of watching? I imagine it knows all the secrets by now. Shall we tell it a new one? Sansa stepped forward. She wore no jewels and carried no weapon. She wore stark gray and brown like bark. Her hair was braided like a banner that could not be seen by any wind. I brought a secret for the tree, she said. A secret about a father and a son. Ramsay's smile thinned. Sansa, he said, as if he tasted her name. My sweet stray, you have grown a bite. I learned not to be a dog, she said. It took time. Jon took the letter from his belt. We have it from your maester's hand that Roose Bolton died of poison administered by Lady Valda. He spoke flatly, as if reciting from a ledger. We have it from the mouths of servants who heard the screams in the floor that there was a baby, and that the baby cried on the day he learned the sound of your hounds' names. We have it from men who brought water and found blood. He took a breath and let the gods hear that it did not shake. We have it from the law of men and gods that kinslaying is a stain that no snow can cover. Ramsay's face changed the way a beast's does when the man who owns it dies. Subtly, in the shape of the eyes, in the set of the mouth. Then the smile slid back on his face as if it had never left. Such stories, he said lightly. How quaint. Hearts and trees and the old wives with their old wine. Do you want me to cry? I can do it. Look. He squeezed his eyes and made 2 tears. They hung in the cold air like ornaments and did not fall. I have never had a father in any way that mattered, he said, almost conversationally. The man was a leech disguised as lace. He taught me what I needed to know, and I did it better than he ever did. If that makes me a kinslayer, then the name is a toy and you are children. He had made a mistake. He had said what he believed, his fatal vanity, and he had said it under the eyes of the heart tree. His men-at-arms shifted where they stood, a small move like a muscle twitch. Wolken's breath rasped. His eyes were on the roots. Sansa tilted her head. Your men will not swear for you under the heart tree. Ask them. Ramsay turned graciously, like a host. Men. The first man opened his mouth. No words came out. The second man cleared his throat, coughed, swallowed, shook his head. The third said, My mother would cut my tongue out with her own 2 hands if I said the word. The fourth did not look at Ramsay at all. He looked at the tree and kept looking until his eyes filmed with cold water. It is a pretty pantomime, Ramsay said. His hand twitched toward Wolken's shoulder. The maester flinched. A kind of silence fell, the kind that has steps in it. Jon felt Ghost stiffen beside him, the wolf's head lowering. A sound beginning in his chest that had nothing to do with the night. You do not have to fight us, Jon said quietly, to Ramsay and to the men and to Wolken and to the tree. You do not have to fight anyone. Open your gates. Give us back our hall and the men you have taken to fill it. Bind your hands and lift your wrists to the gods and ask them to judge you. We will let them do it. I swear it. Ramsay laughed. It burst out of him like something breaking. Ask the gods? Which? The ones that live in sticks and snow and sap? The ones whose faces are carved by men who don't know the faces of their own children. Wolken made a small sound. It was like the sound a mouse makes when it realizes the cat is not playing. He took a step forward, then 2, as if someone's hand had pushed him between the shoulder blades. My lord, he said, and his voice shook like water when a boulder falls into it. I saw him stick the knife into Lord Roose under his arm where there are fewer ribs. I saw the blade go in until it was a tongue in his heart. I saw him smile. I wrote the lie because he told me to, and he had his dogs bite my leg and show me the bone. He lifted his robe and there it was. The bite, a cuff of torn flesh around a shin that had not healed straight. I wrote it because I wanted to keep writing, and now I would like to stop. The men-at-arms looked at Wolken, then at the tree, then at Ramsay, whose smile had stopped being a face and had become a wound that would not stop bleeding. Sansa's breath smoked once, twice. Jon felt the moment tear like cloth. Go back to your hall, he said to Ramsay, before anyone could break the silence and shatter the delicate thing being born inside it. Go back to your hall and think about what you would like your name to be worth when the snow melts. You have until sundown tomorrow to open your gates." Ramsay stepped close, so close that the heat coming off him felt like fever. "You want me to kneel?" he hissed. "You want me to grovel to a name that was a noise in a bastard's throat?" "I want the North to live," Jon said. "Names are for men who are still alive when the sun comes up." They parted then, not with handshakes, not with any word said. Guest right held like fragile ice, and then it did not have to, because the godswood had taken the words inside it and turned them to something else. Ramsay walked out of the circle of the trees. His men walked with him, but not close. Wolkan stayed where he was, shivering. That night, the horns blew once in the encampments around Winterfell, not thrice. Once was for watchfulness. The men slept lightly if they slept at all. Sansa did not sleep. She sat by the banked fire with her hands bare to feel the heat and the prickling of returning blood. Jon sat across from her and did not speak. Ghost lay between them, a long pale shadow with a heartbeat. At dawn, Winterfell's outer gate did not open. It shuddered once and held. No riders came out. By noon, Jon could count the men on the walls. Their heads turned and turned. No banners flew. Snow began to fall, small flakes like ashes that did not melt on the tongue. By late afternoon, a man scrambled awkwardly onto the wall walk and waved a rag on a stick. It was white, but not a clean white. Jon lifted his hand. The man vanished, then reappeared at the sally port with half a dozen others. The port opened and they walked out with their hands raised, the palms empty, their breath smoking in steady, terrified puffs. They came to Jon's guards and stopped. "He's locked in the Great Hall," the first man said. His accent was from the hills east of the King's Road. "We shut the doors. We tied them. He told us they would burn us. We do not have wood enough to burn. We have nothing to eat. Half the men have run, or would if the gates opened. We don't want to die for him. We don't want to die at all. Let us kneel for you, if kneeling for him means we get to keep our tongues." "Where are the keys?" Jon asked. "In his belt," said another man and spat without spitting. "Body has a belt. Body is a thing with knives." Jon nodded once. "Walk away from the gates," he said. "Stand under the eyes of the gods and do not move. If any man comes out with a weapon or on a horse, lie down and put your hands over your head." They did as they were told. The dusk gathered into itself. The air smelled like iron filings. Inside Winterfell, the great hall had been shut like a tomb. The cords that bound its handles were fat and oiled. It took an axe brought from the smithy to cut them. When at last the doors swung, slow and resentful, the hall inside was dim, the rushes sour with winter and worse. The dais at the far end was empty of men and heavy with something else. Ghost's head lifted. The wolf's nose wrinkled as if it had met a scent it did not recognize as animal and did not approve of as human. Ramsay stood alone near the hearth. A knife hung at his belt. 2 more knives lay on the table within an easy reach. He looked smaller without a crowd to bounce his voice off. "No fight?" he asked, sounding almost disappointed. "No fight," Jon said. Sansa stood at his shoulder. Davos was at the other. Tormund somewhere like a mountain that had chosen a corner to be in. Around the walls, winter and men waited. Ramsay laughed softly, then louder, then until the sound shook itself off his face and fell to the stone like something ugly one drops when it turns out to be heavier than it looks. He reached for the knife. Ghost's growl became a thread that ran through the hall and pulled on all their hearts. "No," Jon said. Ramsay's hand hovered. He had lived his life in the place where the next cruelty gave him breath. He stood now in a room that had none for him. He looked at Sansa, as if she were a thing that might still answer him. "You want me to kneel," he said, but there was no poison in it. There was nothing in it at all. Something in him had found the bottom. Sansa did not look away. "I want Winterfell." Ramsay's lip lifted, showing his teeth like a dog who did not know what else to do. Then the lip fell. He unbuckled the knife belt. He laid it on the table with a care that might once have been for a lover. He turned and put his hands behind his back. He bent his knees and lowered himself until he was on the stone. He looked at Jon's boots. "I am Ramsay Bolton," he said. "I surrender the keys to Winterfell to the Confederacy of North and Free Folk. I bind my hands to the judgment of the gods." Wolkan, who had followed them in with a courage built more from despair than anything else, let out a sound like a breath he had been holding underwater for years. Tormund grunted. Davos's eyes closed and opened, and when they opened they were wet. Jon did not move for a long moment. He felt the weight of it press into his bones, the way a sword's weight does when one has carried it so long that his spine has learned to bend to it and must now learn to be straight again. He walked forward. He took the belt with its knives. He handed it to Davos without looking, and Davos took it delicately, as if it might burst into teeth. "Wolkan," Jon said, and the maester flinched, then straightened. "Fetch the keys." Wolkan did. He brought a ring of them so heavy it looked like an anchor. He put them into Jon's hands and, because there was nothing else to do, he sobbed once, hard, like a child. They opened the gates. The sound the iron made was familiar and yet felt new. A groaning complaint, a rusty prayer, a hinge screaming at having to be a hinge again. The people in the yard stood where they had been told to stand, and when they saw the gates too slow opening they began to cry and talk and make the small noises humans make when something that had been biting them stops. They did not storm in. This too was part of Sansa's plan. The first through the gate were not men with spears. They were women carrying baskets, and the baskets were full of bread. They walked to the kitchen yard and made a line and gave a loaf to every pair of hands that came to them. Hands that shook and hands that did not, and hands that tried to take two and could not because the eyes of the gods were on them. Behind the women came boys carrying wood and men carrying salt and two old men carrying a barrel of small beer between them with a care that might have been comic if it were not holy. Only after the bread had been put into mouths did the spears come in, and they went to the walls and the gates and the armory and walked the bounds like shepherds, not conquerors. Ramsay was bound in a room with a window too small for any man to get through and a fire set in it, so that he would not die of cold before he could die of something else. There were no dogs in the kennel. The last of them had been killed when the men who had fed them could not bear to feed them any more and had slashed their throats with knives that had once cut meat. Sansa climbed the steps to the great keep as if they had been cut for her feet, and perhaps they had been. There was no robe on her shoulders, and there were no jewels anywhere on her person, and still when she stood in the great hall the room changed shape around her to accommodate what she was. Jon came and stood 3 steps down from the dais. The room was full of men and women, free folk with their rough coats and northern men with their smoother ones, maids with flour on their sleeves, a blacksmith whose hands could not stop opening and closing as if they were remembering iron. "We will do this where the gods can see," Jon said quietly to Sansa. "Under the heart tree." She nodded. Barrow kings once judged men with their swords laid across their knees. "We have no crown and no sword that belongs to a king. We have a tree." They brought Ramsay out at noon the next day. The sky was the pale of a drowned man's eyes. The heart tree's red tears had frozen at their tips into beads. Ramsay's hands were bound before him, not behind. He walked with his head high. If fear had made a home in his belly, it did not look out through his face. The people gathered in the godswood, but it was not a mob. The Confederacy had rules and it kept them. Children were not allowed to the front. Women with babes stood well back where the wind could not hear their breath. Men who had held Bolton spears stood with their heads bare. Men who had held none stood beside them, and the line where one became the other was not the sort of line anyone cared to draw with a finger. Wyman Manderley had come. He had lost 2 stone and the meat of his face hung in different folds now. He nodded at Jon as if he were acknowledging a craftsman's work. Edera Umber stood with a hand on the shoulder of a boy who must have been one of the many Umbers who share one man's name among them. Her grip was firm enough to leave marks. Alice Karstark stood with Sigorn, their fingers touching. They did not call it a trial. The word they used in that place was judgment, and the difference between the two mattered to people who lived with winter on their lips. Ramsay was given the chance to speak. He spoke and said nothing that would turn a god's ear, and so the gods listened to the silence he didn't intend. Wolkan gave his statement with his head bare to the cold. He did not read from a page. He spoke it as if to read it would be to write it in his mouth, and he wanted it to be gone forever once he had said it. The servants spoke. The men-at-arms spoke. No one hissed or cheered. The heart tree watched. In the end, Jon looked to Sansa. Sansa looked at the faces, hers, the trees, the people's, and nodded once. "Kinslayer?" she said softly, and the word went into the tree and out of it again. And in the hands of the wind it had the weight of a law. They did not make a spectacle of the death. It was done with a sword's clean bite and not with dogs or fear. Jon took no pleasure in it. He took no revulsion either. He felt the awful human relief of something finished that had to be finished. After, they did the work that makes a country. They wrote on parchment and carved on wood. They called the Confederacy by no name that could be shouted in battle. They called it simply Winter's Compact. The North and the free folk bound themselves under it. Every lord who signed beside his name wrote also the name of his house's kitchen maid, or his best hunter, or the old man who sat near the fire and knew stories of wolves. This, Sansa said, and her hand did not tremble, is so that you remember you have more names than the one you wear to feast. Lyanna Mormont wrote her name in a sure, small hand that did not look like a child's. She then put down the name of the bearkeeper's sister who cooked the porridge. Wyman Manderly wrote his name fat and sprawling, and then he wrote the name of the guildmaster who salted the fish. Edera Umber wrote her name and then the name of the woman who mended cloaks. Alice Karstark wrote her name and the name of the boy who kept the fire in the little hall lit through the night. They apportioned land in the new gift to free folk families who had never thought to own a plot that did not have to be defended with a knife. The Thens took a stretch of dark land near an old iron pit and smiled to see red earth on their hands. A raider who had once been named for the color of blood, he liked best put down a spear and picked up a broad knife for slicing bark into strips. And his daughter learned the names of trees from a woman with a Serwyn name. The rules were written plain and often. No raiding under stark sky, no lie told under weirwood leaves, no refusal of bread to a hungry man unless that man had broken bread and then broken bone. Jon did not make himself a king. When men shouted the word, he shook his head. He let them call him Lord Protector of the North and the Gift when they needed to call him anything at all, and even then, he liked best the sound of his name alone. Sansa kept her own titles and more. She was Lady of Winterfell in the old way, which was to say with no need for men to interpret it for her. Rickon came back to them a week after the gates opened, led by Edera Umber herself in a procession that had no music but the slap of boots in snow. He had grown tall, he was still wild. When he saw Jon, he did not smile. He ran into him and hit him in the belly with his hard head and made Jon grunt. Sansa stood very still, and then she moved, and she gathered them both in with her arms, and for a moment they were nothing but a tangle of Starks, which is to say, a tangle of people who had learned that a family is a country first. Tormund became a thing called Speaker for the Free Folk, which he laughed at until he had to stand up and speak, and then he took it like a man takes an iron pot by its handle and realizes it holds soup. He lifted his hand at moots and stopped men from talking when the talking had gone too far. He delivered the votes. He became the sort of man who could be asked to settle a dispute about a fence post and would do it without breaking the fence, the post, or the men. Davos made lists and then made better lists and then taught other men to make them. He put the names of things on slates and set them in the kitchens of 3 halls and learned which cooks could read. He counted arrow shafts like blessings. He counted sacks of barley like hearts that should not stop. He never stopped seeing the boy who had been killed for the crime of being born, and he never stopped being grateful for the men who might not be. Melisandre did not ask for thanks, and no one offered her any. She walked the godswood and stood in the kitchens and knelt in her cell in the night, and the fire she sought did not seem to be in any of those places, and yet she kept looking, because sometimes faith is not the fire but the looking. Once, Sansa found her outside the little door to the hall where the free folk met to decide whose sheep had eaten whose winter cabbage. "You chose well," Melisandre said without turning. "I chose what I knew," Sansa said. "Men and hunger and fear. Fires go out. I wanted something that would not." "You chose a country," Melisandre said. "You saved a soul. Whether it was your own remains to be seen." The first test of the compact came on a night when the wind made a sound like knives drawn one by one. A cry went up along the old road to Barrowton, and men who had been free folk 3 months and Northmen their whole lives picked up spears and went to sea. It was a caravan sent by a small lord who had not believed the letters. He tried to take his grain to Winterfell by way of a frozen ford. The ice broke under the rear cart and a wheel sank. Men with flayed man badges laid hands on their weapons and then looked up and saw 20 men with no flayed man anywhere on them, and something in their hands loosened. "Easy," said the speaker for that stretch of road. A man whose name had once been Crowkiller and was now Jory. "We'll take the grain back to your hall. You'll eat it. You'll send a letter saying you have eaten it and you have not sent it where it would do no good." The Lord hemmed and hawed, then looked at his men and saw something in their faces that had not been there a year ago. It was not fear, and it was not courage, and it was not hunger. It was the knowledge that something larger than they were had been made on their behalf. He nodded. They dug the wheel out. They turned the cart around. They went home. The second test came when a man broke guest right in a hamlet not 3 days from Deepwood Motte. He had fed a traveler and then come in the night to take back the bread he had given and the traveler's silver with it. The village gathered and brought the man to the thingstone by the old ash. He had his excuses. His son was ill. His wife had gone cold. The traveler had looked like someone who might not mind being robbed. The village heard him and did not move. The speaker took a cup with salt and bread in it and held it up and said nothing. The man began to cry. The speaker did not speak. The village did not move. In the end, the man put the cup to his lips and drank the salt and choked on the bread and lived. And he lived with the knowledge that his mouth would never again be clean until he died. This, too, is how countries are made, in the private shame of men who do wrong and are not killed for it. Winter bit harder, a bit like a thing with reasons. The river froze so deep that men bored holes to pull out fish and got nothing but a sense of the river's patience in return. The snow on the roofs of Winterfell piled like the memory of white sheets thrown over the dead. The wall fires were banked in the long night, and the men who watched them slept in shifts and woke with their hands stinging. And yet, children cried less. The kitchen steamed. There were rules where there had been fear. In a hall in the New Gift, a free folk girl and a Serwyn boy were married under laths hung with winter berries. And the man who spoke the words said different names for the same god, and nobody laughed because they were hungry to hear the words in any language. John went to the wall more often, as if his feet could not forget the way even if his mind had learned a new path. He stood on the ramparts and watched the far north, where the sky sometimes moved in colors the south never learned, green and white sliding over each other like fish scales. He did not bring the horns to his mouth and blow them, not yet. When he slept, he dreamed sometimes of a blue eye and sometimes of a wolf running through trees with red leaves that brushed his back like hands, and sometimes of a girl's voice saying his name as if it were a place to come in out of the weather. Sansa ran Winterfell with a competence that did not feel like power because it was aimed outward, toward other people's bellies and beds. She walked the kitchens and the armories and the ice-slicked courtyards. People learned her tread and its meaning. She set aside rooms in the outer keep for those who came out of the woods, cold past speech. She made a practice of walking the inner wall at dawn when the frost was a pelt and listening to the sound of wood hitting wood in the yard below where men practiced. She wrote letters to places where no one had written letters for years. She learned the names of women who had buried 3 children each and did not know what to call the one who lived, because the voice that had said names was gone. One morning, as the sun clawed at the horizon like an animal that had forgotten how to rise, she found John waiting in the yard with Ghost, the wolf's fur roughed silver in the salt light. John's breath smoked the same way it had the night he had read the letter. In his face there was something harder and kinder than it had been, as if the thing inside him that had been commanded to be a sword had been reminded that it was also a plow. "Walk with me," he said, and she did. They walked to the godswood. The snow had formed small ridges where the wind had arranged it by whim. The heart tree was beaded again with red ice. Sansa put her palm flat against its bark. It was cold, but not dead. The cold in it was the kind that belongs to living things that have learned to wait. "We will need a king," John said very softly, as if admitting it to the tree first so it would not seem like he was admitting it to himself. "Not now." Maybe not for a long time. But kings make certain kinds of men behave. If there is to be one, it should be the kind of king who needs a country to be something first and a crown after. You will not wear it? Sansa said. It was not a question. He smiled, and the smile reached his eyes, the way the light sometimes does when it is patient. No. I am a man who stands in doorways and says no to those who want to come in with knives and yes to those who bring bread. I am not a man for thrones. The wood would creak under me. She laughed then, a sound that surprised them both, and it flew up into the branches where it hung like a small bright thing. Then we will make something else, she essayed. ID. Something that does not need a king first. We will make a word that means more than a name. There is a word in the old tongue, they say, for a promise the winter believes. We will find it and write it into the boards of the hall. And if the dead come before we are finished, Jon said. Then we will finish it while we are fighting them, Sansa said. Nothing important was ever finished before it was needed. That winter, under a sky that was stingy with light, the North and the free folk learned each other. A then taught a Manderley boy how to take the antler tips off a stag without cracking them. A Manderley cook taught the then sister how to keep bread from becoming a brick when the leaven failed. A Serwyn woman taught a raider how to mend a thatch with frozen hands, and the raider taught her son how to strike a fire flint without wasting sparks. Edera Umber sat with Alice Karstark, and they spoke of men with large hands who did not know how to use them for anything but breaking, and then they spoke of boys with small ones who would have to learn better. Rickon learned to read in the long shadows of the library and to fight in the short shadows of the yard. He learned to say the names of the men who had died with his father without choking. He learned to say the names of the free folk who had stood with him now without forgetting that they had once been men you watched for raiding parties. He learned, faster than anyone else, to take his boots off without sitting down. He learned that if he threw his head at Jon's chest, Jon would grunt and Sansa would laugh and Ghost would wag his tail and the world would not end. Wyman Manderley sent ships north along the coast to trade with people who had never traded with anyone south of the Wall, and came back with whale oil and stories of lights that moved and fish that glowed when you pulled them out of the water. He set a small fleet to bring timber downriver and gave the free passage to any boat that carried herbs or dried meat with a letter that said it was bound for Winterfell stores. He took satisfaction in measuring any portion of his enormous body that appeared to shrink and telling himself it was justice making room in him for other things. Davos sat by candlelight with men who had never learned their letters and drew pictures of arrows and sacks and bowls. He made letters out of pictures until the men could see the shape of what needed to be gotten from one place to another, and because he did it with them instead of for them, they learned to do it for themselves. He taught a free folk woman with one ear how to count by twos, and she taught him how to hear the weather coming in the way his one bad hand ached an hour before it struck. Tormund learned to speak plain to men who liked their words to come in straight lines. He learned to sit through arguments that went on longer than any fight would have and to thump the table only when the thump would make sense. He learned that telling a story about a man insulted because another man had laughed at his spear was sometimes enough to make a third man stop shouting. Melisandre found her fire, finally, not in a brazier or a hall but in the sight of Sansa kneeling to wipe up ale spilled by one of the boys in the kitchen. It was a small thing and it moved inside her like a coal on the last night before dawn. She went to the wall and stood on the heights and looked north where the color moves. She did not ask Stannis for forgiveness because he was dead and it would do no good. She asked the air for a sign and saw a raven beating its way toward her with a strip of cloth tied to its leg. The raven's cloth was gray. The words on the little paper inside were few. They came from a marsh village north of the last river where no ravens had flown in a generation. We saw men in the snow who did not breathe. They walked. We hid. We will run. Melisandre brought the words to Jon and watched him read them. His face did not change. The coal inside her pulsed once, twice. "We are not done making our country," Sansa said, reading over his shoulder. "We will not be done until we die," Jon said. He rolled the parchment and tied it with the ribbon and put it inside his coat. He looked up and his eyes were winter and a hearth and a door standing open. "We will bring the horns to our mouths when it is time. When we do, all the words we have said will mean something." They stood together under the white sky. Wind walked through the yard like a visitor, not entirely welcome but not entirely to be thrown out either. The gates of Winterfell were open, and the men on them were men who had put their own names to a piece of wood that said they would keep them open for those who came with the right sort of need. In the God's Wood, the heart tree's tears had thawed and dripped and frozen again. A slow patience. Far to the north, in a place where there were no names and no rules and no kitchens, something stirred and began to walk. Jon put his hand on Ghost's head. Sansa put her hand on Jon's sleeve. The sound the wind made then was thin and clean, like a blade being pulled from a scabbard that had been oiled with care. Winter's compact held. When the horns blew, their sound would go down along the roads and the rivers and the small paths and the far, invisible threads between people who had learned each other's names and would not, this time, forget them.